Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. We know we're the only thing standing between you and a ham sandwich, so or turkey sandwich, whatever you're going to have for lunch. So we're going to get right to it, and we have a great group of fun panelists, a lot of white guys, but that's okay. Many of you in the room are familiar with the Hippocratic Oath, the pledge doctors make to respect both science and their patients. It's named, of course, after the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, and I found a quote attributed him that I think is appropriate for our conversation. He said, quote, "Wherever there is a love of medicine, there's a love of humanity." And some of the people gathered here at this conference are clearly brilliant scientists and researchers who have the God-given ability to create great cures, but some of us just love medicine and want to help accelerate the miracles that are waiting to manifest themselves. And the reality is that takes money. So we've invited some of the leading figures from charities and advocacy organizations to talk about their role in supporting the search for cures. So please join me in welcoming Derek Rapp, who's president and CEO of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. Is that right? Yes. Did I say that right, Derek? And David Panzirer, trustee of the Helmsley Trust. Mr. Dana Ball, who's CEO of Unitio. Right, Dana? Did I say it right? Katie. And co-founder and executive director of the T1D Exchange, which I called the TID Exchange earlier, and I was corrected, thank God. And Dr. Randal Mills, president and chief executive officer of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, or California Stem Cell Agency, and of course you just heard from Randy. So let's get right to it. I'm going to start by having each person on the panel tell us a little bit about their organization. So if I could start with Derek, why don't you start?
Thanks, Katie. JDRF is the world's largest private funder of type 1 diabetes research. We've been in existence for 45 years at this point. Started in northeastern U.S. by a couple sets of parents of kids with type 1 diabetes who wanted to focus an organization on trying to cure type 1 diabetes, specifically type 1 for their kids. And obviously I'm focusing on type 1 here as opposed to type 2, which is obviously always a source of some confusion, and one of the challenges, frankly, that we all face, I think, is for people to understand which disease we're talking about. JDRF is still a parent and mission-driven organization, and in fact, I am a parent of a child with type 1 diabetes. Our son Turner was diagnosed when he was 10. He's 22 now, and he joined my wife's aunt, an uncle, and 2 first cousins, and a second cousin with type 1 diabetes. And then we also have a son who, like Caroline Panzirer, is in a clinical trial because she has multiple antibodies. And so we're trying to keep him from getting the disease too. JDRF has about 25 PhD and MD scientists on staff. We have funded about $2 billion, a little over $2 billion in research over the history of the organization, and also worked to try to get a lot of other funding through particularly government bodies such as NIH, where we've helped secure about $2.5 billion for funding over the last roughly 20 years. And we are a national organization in the United States, and then we also have 6 affiliates at different parts of the world. So I'll stop right there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And let's go to David. I know you have 2 kids, and your kids are here, right?
Yes, they are. So I'm a father and a husband, and my 3 children are actually in the audience. My oldest daughter, Morgan, and forgive me for whoever attended the family panel on Thursday, a little bit of duplication, but my oldest daughter was diagnosed with type 1 back in 2007. My daughter, Caroline, has all of the antibodies and is at high risk to get the disease, and thankfully my son, Luke, doesn't have any of the antibodies. So about 5 months after my daughter was diagnosed, my grandmother passed away and named me of one of 5 trustees of what's now a $5 billion trust. My wife will tell you I don't take a subtle hint. If you want to get my attention, you need to slap me upside the head, and it's absolutely true. These 2 events happening 5 months apart were not such a subtle hint as to what I should be doing with my life. So I knew absolutely nothing about philanthropy. I knew nothing how to get a drug or device or a therapy to market. I knew how to care for a child with type 1. I spent the better part of 18 months traveling around and learning and understanding the landscape so that we can put our resources to work and not be duplicative, but to be impactful. So at the Helmsley Trust, we really have 2 pillars of the type 1 diabetes program. One is to prevent and delay type 1, and the other is to improve outcomes. And it's very simple. Our philosophy really is to ease the burden of managing this disease so that in the event we find that elusive cure, people will be healthy enough to participate.
I'm just curious, David, obviously it's a very significant trust. So how much, I mean, how is it, it's not specifically all for type 1
No.
diabetes, is it? I mean, it has a broad range of causes
Yeah, so
that the trust supports.
It's also not for dogs, despite what was been in the press, but
That's good to
yes,
hear.
it is.
Although I like dogs.
I do too, but I prefer to help people. About 70% of the foundation has been geared towards health and medical research.
Okay, great. All right, and so now we're going to go to Dana Ball. The T1D Exchange is one of the organizations I know that you helped get off the ground. So why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of how that came to be, Dana?
Sure. So I started my career over 30 years ago as a patient advocate during the HIV and AIDS crisis and was introduced to type 1 diabetes by Lee Iacocca and the Iacocca family. I became executive director of the Iacocca Foundation 15 years ago. I worked with Lee for 7 years, really focusing on one specific question. What was the highest and best use of private philanthropy dollars in a large and complicated space like type 1 diabetes? I was at the Iacocca Foundation when I met David Panzirer, was recruited to go to New York to help David learn and to build the Helmsley type 1 diabetes program. And it was really during the landscape, that first year of learning, that we realized there were two threats to moving type 1 diabetes therapies forward. One was we saw the changes in healthcare reform, and we've talked about this a lot in several panels over the past 2 days, access. How we felt confidence the science was moving forward, but how are we going to translate these therapies quickly? How are we going to make sure they were scalable? And how were we going to make sure that they were available to everyone affected by type 1 diabetes? The second thing that was really important was time and cost. The time and cost is on the cover of every major publication globally. We've seen that a drug could cost as much as $5 billion to bring to market. And over the past couple of days, we've heard about personalized medicines, the N of 1 medicines. And they all pointed to one thing, the need for evidence and the need for a new model, a platform that could help really accelerate everything from discovery to delivery of these new therapies. And that's what drove the creation of the exchange.
And Randy, I know, how is the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, it's got a $3 billion fund. So how do you fit into this whole thing?
Well, we are disease agnostic. So the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine exists to accelerate stem cell treatments to patients with unmet medical needs. We're a little bit unusual is that we have a technology focus, not a disease specific focus. With that said, type 1 diabetes and diabetes in general does lend itself to cell therapy cures very well. And so we have made significant investments in diabetes and in type 1 diabetes and have a number of, I think we have currently 15 active products right now that we're advancing.
So in general, though, you all obviously support a variety of diseases in terms of funding research, correct?
We do basically 5 things. We have infrastructure programs, so we'll literally build buildings. We have cell banks. We do education, so we train everything from high school students through postdocs on how to actually do the research. And then we have 3 phases of development that we fund: discovery, translational, and clinical. But again, not disease specific.
Okay. And Derek and David, you guys are going to talk a little bit about the impact your group has had in developing treatments and drug, delivery of therapies for type 1 diabetes patients. Can you tell us bring us up to speed on what you all have done?
Sure. And I would say that there are a lot of different areas where there's been significant activity in the type 1 diabetes space. We have more than 50 clinical trials that are happening right now and work that has been funded by JDRF, so human testing, and that's in everything from artificial pancreas, which is mechanical devices that will take a lot of the burden off of the person with type 1 diabetes in terms of the management of glucose, and then also encapsulated cells, islet cells like this that will express insulin naturally in a person when the person has excess glucose, improved insulins, and then also areas like prevention and complications. So we're active in a lot of different areas. And also, I would say, importantly, just plain the understanding of this disease. It's a complicated disease, as I think a lot of people here understand. And we've been able to ask and answer a lot of fundamental questions that will help us eventually figure out how we can really disarm this disease and keep people from never getting it in the first place, and for those who have it then to truly have cures.
Things like genomics and some of the technology, things that we talk about that has helped us kind of increase our understanding of diseases like cancer. Has the same been true of juvenile diabetes?
Moderately so, only I would say specifically to your question, because we know that more than 50 genes are part of a complex around type 1 diabetes. So certainly we see that genetics are important, but they are not the full explanation. For example, if you look at identical twins, only half of identical twin sets will both have type 1 diabetes if one does. So obviously there's some factor, some catalytic moment, whether it's a virus or maybe a source of stress or something that causes the person to have the disease too. So there are multiple factors.
What are you excited about in terms of what you've learned, David, in the research that you've been able to be a part of?
So, I've learned a lot. I've traveled quite a bit. I think, we strive to understand the landscape of type 1. We strive to be an impactful player. We didn't come here and set up and build our own silo. We engaged the other funders from the NIH to the JDRF to ADA and a bunch of others who have played in the space. We really look to be impactful and not duplicative, and the only way to do that is to share what we're doing with the other funders and be a completely transparent and open book. Some of the things that we've done, we actually funded and created the T1D exchange when Dana was on this side of the fence. He goes from funder to fundraising. I'm sure he can tell you how painful that is. But what the T1D exchange for us really is a compass based on human data that highlights where the gaps are in the type 1 diabetes space. And I think we've also increased the awareness around type 1. Type 1's the only disease that I know of where you're making dosing decisions with a drug that can kill you. You're making those decisions 24/7, and 98% of the time you don't have the benefit of a clinician being involved. So it's,
Stressful.
And by the way, if you're right 60% of the time, you're doing really, really well.
Yes.
So how do you measure success, both in terms of your trust and your organization and in terms of you personally?
Sure. So I said this the other day, and there's no roadmap telling us how to get where we're trying to get to, right? If there were a roadmap, we'd be done. We wouldn't be sitting here. All the diseases would be gone. To me, success starts with understanding the landscape that we're trying to impact. And my team is constantly scouring the landscape, looking for therapies and or devices that can greatly impact the way people are living with this disease. For me, I know that there's three things that actually have to happen in order to get a drug, a device, or a therapy to market. The FDA or the regulators need to approve it, the payers need to pay for it, and some company needs to believe that they can make money from it so that they will manufacture and distribute it. Any one of those three things is an absolute deal breaker and a killer for a therapy or device. So to me, success is measured by moving the needle towards one of those three things happening. On a personal level, I have a much higher bar. To me, success is having a therapy, a device, or a drug that I can hold in my hands that's approved, that allows people with this disease to live better.
Derek, and I'm going to get to Randy in a second about measuring success, but how complicated has it been to just increase awareness? Because there is a lot of confusion out there, especially as adult onset diabetes or type 2 diabetes gets so much attention because of the obesity epidemic, both in the United States and worldwide. So how have you been able to differentiate and make sure that people understand what type 1 diabetes is?
I can say it's an ongoing challenge for an organization and also for a parent of someone with this disease. We need people to understand, though, what this is so that they understand how helping JDRF can help people not only with type 1 diabetes, but autoimmune diseases in general. And in fact, actually, even people with type 2 diabetes can in many cases benefit from work that we're doing. But no, it's always a challenge. It's a PR challenge.
You've had a lot of celebrities get involved, haven't you? I mean, I
Sure.
think I recall Kevin Kline
Yep,
sort
Kevin
of was
Kline
very
has-
involved
so,
with type 1
right,
diabetes.
He's a
and
T1D dad. Yeah.
Mary Tyler Moore.
Yes,
So
exactly.
I feel like they have really helped. Nick Jonas, sorry, I forgot, the Jonas Brothers. But you're right, younger and a new generation of awareness, right? That's been probably very helpful to the cause, hasn't it?
That sounds kind of exploitive, so I'll say I'm sad for them that they have reason to be involved, but of course
Well,
they
no,
sort
I
of build
mean,
awareness.
I think they
Sure.
want to do something positive
Of
with
course.
their
No,
situations.
absolutely.
and-
I applaud them. They have really stepped up in a big way. You're right.
So Randy, tell me, how do you measure success? You've got this $3 billion fund, and I know that when you came, you just have been there for 2 years, and you came from industry.
Right.
And when you got there, you thought there wasn't an apparatus in place that really did measure results, right?
Well, yeah, it was difficult for us to objectively measure and figure out whether or not we were being true to our mission. So, since our mission is to accelerate stem cell treatments to patients with unmet medical needs, the word accelerate sort of implies we're a bit of a time machine. And so we should have things that should be going faster than they otherwise would if CIRM weren't around. But we really we didn't have any mechanisms in place to measure those things on a consistent basis. And so it was very difficult to figure out at first to the extent what benefit that we were having. In December, we got that all straightened out now, and so we are a very, very metric-driven organization. Everyone every person throughout the organization is responsible for metrics that roll up into 6 big. We call them the big six goals, which by 2020 we will have accomplished, which includes 65 new therapies in stem cell therapies in the clinical trial. But they're aggressive enough that if we don't focus on them and we don't measure them monthly and quarterly and yearly and always have them in front, we're not going to trip into them by chance. So it required a cultural shift at the organization. There was some anxiety that went along with that cultural shift. It's settled down now, and it's clearly producing better results.
It was interesting because you and I were talking before we came up, before your earlier panel, and you were talking about the paradigm that you were using, or that the organization was using, in terms of the amount of funding and how much it would take for a clinical trial and how people would apply for grants. And in a way, it was hurting your ability to move science forward. Can you explain?
Sure. It centered around, we would say, we would put out a call for, let's say, a clinical trial, a phase 1 clinical trial, and the call would say, you can have funding up to 4 years and $20 million. And lo and behold, every trial that came in was 4 years and cost $20 million. Now, I've run a lot of phase 1 clinical trials. I have never, the average length of time is 19 months, but not at CIRM.
But they were incentivized to apply for that much money over that period of time, right?
Yeah.
Or they'd lose money.
Yeah, and if ironically, if you got it done faster, we would take away your overhead money. So we would literally financially disincentivize you to do the trial faster. So we've gotten that straightened out now, and some brilliant person said, what if we don't have a cap? And we just make them justify how much it cost. And the average cost of a trial went from all being $20 million to $7 million because we took the cap off. And the length of time, we said, well, we're just going to pay you in stages. We're going to pay you on milestones instead of pay you over time. And all of a sudden, milestones started getting done more quickly. So little things like that.
Yeah. And Dana, tell us about how your ongoing efforts to support research help to attract additional commercial dollars, and how you go about finding that outside funding.
Sure. So when we designed the exchange, it was important to have a resource that everyone in the ecosystem would benefit from, and that really ranges from patients to policymakers and everyone in between. So what we developed are a clinic network of 75 centers with access to over 100,000 patients. We've characterized 26,000. By the end of the year, it'll be 30,000 patients in a patient registry, collected medical records and patient-reported outcomes. From that population, that cohort of 26,000 patients, we've collected biosamples on over 2,000 samples, and then we have a patient community. Over 16,000 patients and families raised their hand, have joined our community in participating in research. These resources have attracted a membership model. So we are working with everyone in academia, funded by the NIH, funded by JDRF, funded by Helmsley Trust, along with companies and industry. It was very important for us to be able to create high quality, credible resources to solve the problems of time and cost of moving studies in science forward.
And Randy, what about you? I know that you work with industry at a certain point in time when it comes to your research, right?
We highly encourage industry to get involved in what we do. And we do that through a number of different mechanisms. So we're just totally indifferent to the applicant, whether the applicant is academic or nonprofit or for-profit. Doesn't affect our view of how it gets scored. In an attempt, though, a full third of our strategic plan now is an attempt to increase the amount of industry participation that we have, and we're going to try something. It's going to be really interesting to see. It'll happen this year. We have a lot of products at CIRM. 91% of them are unpartnered, and so what we're going to do is we're going to bundle them up and pair them up with $75 million from us for against a matching $75 million from industry to create a stem cell specific company in the state of California that will have the best technologies and be well capitalized right there in California. We'll see how that goes. It'll be interesting. What
do you think about that approach, Derek? I'm just curious.
Well, so we all recognize, all of our different organizations, that the challenge is great and takes a lot more than the resources that any of us have. And so for us to succeed, ultimately, we need dollars to come into the system, and we need to do whatever we can to try to make the opportunities less risky and more compelling for the commercializing entities, because ultimately a product is going to come from a company. And so every dollar that we put into the system is one less dollar that needs to come from that company, makes it just a little more attractive for them to come in. We have right now, we put in place at JDRF 70 relationships with different companies. These are royalty-bearing relationships for us, and they are relatively inexpensive money for those companies so that they will want to or be more apt to come in and invest in the type 1 diabetes-related project, which we think is an imperative in this.
So how do you all pool your resources, and how do you make sure that you're not duplicating efforts? You know, with an organization like Randy, and that, you know, what Randy's doing in California versus what you all are doing, because I know the three of you all, not Randy, but you three, work very closely together.
Yes.
And so, you know, it seems to me with all these advocacy groups, they're often competing rather than collaborating. You all collaborate, but as to my original question, how do you make sure you're not duplicating the efforts of other groups?
Well, we have teams that are, so David and I with our teams are meeting multiple times a year, and our teams are on the phone all the time, same with the exchange. And so certainly we're learning from each other and talking about specific projects and saying, so are you in this one or not, and whatever. And sometimes it's important that we're both in them, and sometimes it's great that we are taking somewhat different views on these opportunities to make sure that we're both feeling somewhat.
How important has it been, David, for you to be able to, you know, as somebody who's had to learn a lot, in a short amount of time to have collaborators like this, like Derek and Dana.
Oh, it's crucially important. I mean, we recognized very early on that we can't do it by ourselves and be naive to think that we could. I was fortunate enough to meet with Patty Stonecipher, who was the first CEO of the Gates Foundation, and she told me, Gates Foundation can't solve any problems. You need to be really laser focused. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, you guys are about the 10 times the size of our budget. If you can't solve anything, we clearly can't. But that really rang true with me. And we came into this understanding that we were part of an ecosystem, not to develop our own. And, our organizations, all of us, we all want the same thing, right? Our end game's the same. Our process, our approach may be a little different, but we're completely open book with whomever wants to see whatever we want, whatever we fund. Our job is to not duplicate. I think that would be the biggest crime, is if we're duplicating efforts. We often fund the same researchers, so it's important to make sure that there's no overlap, or at least we're each aware of what we're doing with each researcher. And that happens a lot more than you would think.
JDRF's vision is a world without type 1 diabetes. It's not JDRF creating a world without type 1 diabetes. It's a world without type 1 diabetes. And so we want all these folks obviously to be part of the success.
And do you find organizations that are competitive and not necessarily collaborative?
Yes. Absolutely true.
Do you want to name them?
This is being televised somewhere? No. So let me say that I think that there are organizations that compete for money, okay? And I would say that, I wouldn't say we compete, I'd say we're frenemies. They ultimately, though, want the same thing, but I think we'd be being dishonest if we didn't say that the competitiveness for fundraising dollars sometimes gets in the way of what would be the right thing for the patient at the end of the day. And I've certainly seen it firsthand, I'm sure. And Derek can speak to it as well.
Yeah, and Dana, how do you deal with that?
Very carefully. A lot of CDAs and a lot of NDAs, but ultimately, and Sean Parker touched on this when you spoke with Sean the other day, when you asked him the question about intellectual property and how is he going to navigate some of the challenges ahead in his platform, in his model that he's creating, which I think is very similar to the T1D exchange model. He said, well, we're hoping to develop trust. And I think you can't underestimate the value of trust. And between JDRF and Helmsley, the T1D exchange, our leadership, and our partners, I think we are really an exemplary model of developing trust, all the way from patients who are engaged with our programs who understand how we're the same, but yet how we're different, how the investigators, whether it's an academia, whether it's a small company, or whether it's a large company, there are many projects that the exchange supports that are funded by David, by Derek, by industry. There's projects and studies where it may be sponsored by Helmsley Charitable Trust, but we may work with a company to donate devices or supplies for that study to reduce the cost of that study. Mm-hmm. So I think what's really remarkable in our community is the work that we've done over the past several years to really work together and create that level of trust. The trust provided an environment where we could have very intimate conversations about our challenges, what's in our pipeline, what's working, what's not working, and then to be able to collectively leverage each other's strengths and resources to move the field forward.
What about accessibility to lower, populations, underserved populations? How are you all handling that? Because it's a problem in, across the field in so many different arenas. And when it comes to treatment of this disease, how do you ensure that you're not sort of just serving the more financially secure population?
So I would jump in first. And I think that there's something really powerful about these models that are being created, these patient-centered models. The first step is don't presume you know the answer. Ask the patients and the families. So we do a lot of research, patient-centered research, with our 16,000 patients and families that are participating in questions every day, in surveys, in research. Listen first. What are their struggles? And as soon as you start to ask these questions, you learn from a very broad demographic of people affected by disease, what's real and what's not real. And we understand that cost and accessibility is a major issue. The health.
How do you get those people to even participate in those kind of questions if, you can't reach them? And I imagine there are a lot of families that aren't even aware that they can participate in that kind of process, right?
Right. So that was part of the goal of the patient community that we developed. We created a platform, and it's available anywhere in English. So we have people all over the world that are part of that community, and they participate in virtual research. So it's been enormous success to be able to reach those people. We recently did a virtual study using devices, capturing continuous glucose monitor, insulin information from the devices, patient-reported outcomes, and we received this incredible email from someone in South Dakota that said, "I'm too far away from any clinic to ever participate in research." And this was an IRB study, but it was a virtual study. He said, "Thank you for doing what you're doing because you're providing hope. I have been able to participate in research because of this platform that you've created."
How do you, this is probably a stupid question, but it's never stopped me before. So how do you go about reaching these people? Do you reach them through their physicians? Do you reach them through public service announcements? I'm just curious.
The web and the internet is an incredible thing. So there's really a few channels. We use social media, which has been enormously successful. We use our clinic network to be able to promote that this community, this platform for patients and families is available. The research community, we do some media, paid media, but it gets very expensive. And with the small number of patients in the US, there isn't a lot of return for finding a needle in a haystack.
Mm-hmm. And Randy, what about you? How do you deal with income inequality and sort of the work you're doing?
So when the FDA approves a very expensive stem cell drug, the FDA will have approved a stem cell drug, and we will be happy. That's step one. Is for us is actually getting these therapies closer to being commercially available, and then we can complain about how much they cost, and I'm sure we will. But actually, as part of everything we do at CIRM and in California, we actually have pricing and access provisions built in to our awards. Our awards are very kind. You don't have to, if the product doesn't fail, you don't have to pay back the money, and you keep all of the IP and so on and so forth. But the one set of provisions that we do have that are in there, and they're very serious, is that there has to be an access plan and cost protection.
And so in closing, gentlemen, let's talk about 5 years out. Because I think that a lot of families out there need encouragement and hope and want to think that a better way is on the horizon. So what are you most excited about when it comes to type 1 diabetes research and even awareness?
Sure. Well, 5 years from now, a person with type 1 diabetes should be treated pretty significantly differently from today, with a sophisticated device system that will allow that person to have far better control in many cases, and with a lot less being asked of that person. The person should also, in many cases, be using an adjunctive drug that will tighten the glucose range even more. And then we should be looking not very far from then at the commercialization of some even better tools and therapies that will allow a person to do great. And by the way, we should, at that point, also be seeing some approaches, I think, that are on a real path toward commercialization for prevention of this disease for at least some people.
What about you, David?
Yeah, so I always say that we really focus on trying to improve care now so that people can be healthy enough to participate in the cure. And I agree with Derek. I think you're going to begin to see automated insulin delivery and making people's lives living with this disease easier and less burdensome. And I think when you ask people what do they want, at the end of the day, they want to do less and think about their disease less. Right. And I think that's crucial. So anything that we develop that is going to ask somebody to do more, it's a non-starter. It's going to die in the water. As far as I'm concerned, what I tell my daughter every day is what you're doing today is the worst it will be in your life, and it will only get better from here. And I wholeheartedly believe that. And I think that in the next 5 years, what she's doing to manage her disease will be significantly easier than it is today.
And that'll ameliorate side effects of this disease, some of the consequences.
Complications, yes.
Complications.
Sure, if you have better glucose control, you should have less complications for sure.
What about you, Randy? What are you excited about?
So we're not disease specific, but when we see out 5 years, we see very clear things. We see 65 new stem cell clinical trials affecting very, very real diseases. We see a translation time, which is currently 8 years for stem cell therapy, getting cut in less than half. We see a brand new regulatory paradigm, and all of that is going to increase the amount of interest from industry jumping into this game and increase the flow through, which I think is going to benefit everyone.
And before I get to Dana, Derek, I'm curious, you talked about your research being helpful for people who have type 2 diabetes as well. Do you see any other disease overlap?
Absolutely, I do. In fact, I often think about a Venn diagram with 3 circles, and there's the type 1 diabetes circle, there's the type 2 diabetes circle, and then there's other autoimmune diseases circle. And there's no doubt that there's significant overlap among the circles. So in fact,
When you say other autoimmune diseases, what specifically are you,
celiac,
encouraged?
Crohn's, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, and the overlap in families, the coincidental relationship that we see is undeniable. And so in fact, we see certain drugs right now that are being tested for type 1 diabetes that we know already help people with some of those other diseases.
Do you collaborate with those advocacy groups?
Other disease groups?
Yes.
Yes. And in fact, I'm excited about the fact that I think, and this is a corny way of putting it maybe, but I think the last chapter that will be written when the book's written on type 1 diabetes and JDRF will actually extend to other diseases. I really believe that.
Which is exciting.
Yeah.
All right, Dana, you can wrap things up. What are you excited about? Bring it home, Dana.
As everyone has said, we really are focused on the outcomes of our patients and families today. So over the next 5 years, we want to deliver a quality improvement program that are going to improve their outcomes and meet the demands of healthcare reform and value-based payment. This program will also generate the data and the evidence to support the needs of both regulatory and reimbursement. And the third thing we do really well is collapse the timelines of studies and trials. We think dedicated resources such as the exchange, these networks, these patient populations, this army of people that are ready and available can turn a 3 to 4 year study into an 18-month study, and we've proven more than once that we can do that.
I think for anyone who doesn't have a child or a loved one with type 1 diabetes, I think it's hard for them to understand what it's like, the stress that's involved, and the constant worry when it comes to caring for a child with this disease. So thank you all so much for everything that you do to help so many families across the United States and really all over the world.
If I may, and I thank you to the scientists, the researchers, because obviously we're funding, but we rely on your great work and intelligence and perseverance. And so we have a symbiotic relationship. And so thanks to all of you for helping our work matter. So thank you.
So it's lunchtime. You have 50 minutes, so eat fast. And the next panel will start in 50 minutes. Thank you.